How's it going, team? Welcome back to another episode of the Average Jazz podcast, where we bring you stories of real people doing extraordinary things. I'm your host, Jack McKiernan, and today we've got an inspiring guest who's making waves in the world of health and wellness. Joining us is the brilliant author and nutritionist, Nish Teixeira-Dias, better known as Nish. She's the mind behind the book, Nourish With Nish, and today we're diving deep into her journey of becoming a worldwide published author, her passion for nutrition, her background in psychology, how that got her where she is today, and from that we dive into the minds of everyday people. You can follow Nish on Instagram at Nourish With Nish, and if you're interested in grabbing a copy of her book and checking out a bit more about her, head over to www.nourishwithnish.com. I'll put all that down below in the description. But before we jump into the conversation, a quick shout out to the sponsor, Viridor Strength. They've got some awesome fitness gear, stuff that I use every day, and you can get yourself 20% off with the code AverageJack at www.viridorstrength.co.uk. And for more content and updates, don't forget to visit www.jackmckiernan.co.uk. All right, let's get into it. I hope you enjoy. Peace. Hi, how's it going? You okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me
Excited
okay?
to be here.
Oh, I'm excited for this one, definitely. Sort of when Nick's been talking to Nick about it and sort of the stuff you've done, I think it'd be good to pick your brain and get an insight into it.
Happy to share anything.
That's cool. I actually tried one of your recipes the other day.
Oh no, which one?
It was the cookies.
Oh, she told me about them. Yeah, I'm actually baking a batch after this for the picnic tomorrow, but I came up with that when I was studying for my masters, and they're not staples, so I don't make them that often, but I do. That is one of the recipes that I think, oh, I did something there.
You did do something. They were very good. They were very good.
Thank you.
I'm not even just saying it, but I mean, to be fair, I like all food. As I imagine, you must enjoy food to do what you've done.
Yes, big time. Yeah, I feel like there's two sides to food, which is obviously like the creative recipe development, flavor, fun side of things, but also the academic, more scientific nutrition side of it. So yeah, having both I think definitely helps because you kind of need both, or at least I find that having both is really, really helpful. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, I did a little bit of, not a deep dive, but I did a little bit of a dive just to sort of give myself, a bit of a boost before speaking to you, and sort of looked at the book and stuff like that. And you did psychology at uni, didn't you?
I did. Yeah.
So how did the food path sort of present itself to you from that?
That's a great question. So originally I got into psychology because I originally wanted to do medicine. And when it came to doing my A-levels, I picked A-levels that would have fit into that. And then when it came to getting the grades, I missed one of them, which obviously, if you miss any of them, you don't get it. But I still wanted to pursue something sciencey, so I went for psychology because people had always been a big interest of mine. And when I was doing my psychology degree, there was a module on it. I can't remember which year it was, but it was nutrition and behavior. And it talked about like loads of different things and some really extreme and interesting case studies. And it was just a bit eye-opening for me. Like I'd never really considered that the two things could be linked so, not drastically, but like so obviously without no one seeming to really take that into account. So I loved that, but at the time didn't really think too much of it, just like really enjoyed it, did really well at that module, moved on kind of thing. And then at the end of my degree, the pandemic hit and I went to Portugal to care for my grandparents because they were living out there alone. And my grandma was going through a course of chemo at the time. And I was just really shocked that like no one seems to have given her any kind of nutritional considerations or advice, given that it was such a big thing to be going through. And at the same time, I'd obviously already signed with the publishing agency to publish my book. And so one side of food was very active in terms of like taking all the photos for the recipes and making sure that everything was tasting really nice and all that kind of stuff. But on the other side, I was having to care for my grandma and was taking all of these deep dives into research and like the nutrition side of things to try and support her from that aspect. And, you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a qualified professional, but I can read research, I can critique research and understand like what's relevant and what's not, to some extent. And now I've forgotten what I was saying. Degree, yes, psychology. So yes, sorry.
That's not obviously, it happens to me all the time.
Thank you. So yeah, those at that time, that year specifically during the pandemic, I think that's when my combination of those two interests really came together. And it was that summer at the end of having been in Portugal for 8 months and almost coming to the end of like the whole publishing process that I thought, I'm going to do a master's in nutrition. And because I had a couple of modules on my psychology undergrad and it was science focused enough as a degree sort of across the board, I didn't really have any problems getting onto my master's course. So yeah, I think it was just a little pivot and I went from there and it's turned out all right, I guess.
The rest is history, as they say. So just rewinding a little bit, you mentioned about the publishing journey, and I've wrote a book, but I self-published, so I cheated in a way. But you got published. So how did that come about? So how did you just end up being like, I'm going to do a cookbook, and here's a publisher who wants it?
Well, I would say firstly, my version is cheating because someone else did most of the work. People that self-publish have to go through way more and do so much more than those that don't. So creds to you for that. How did it come about though? So essentially, maybe about, I think it was 2016, it's like almost 10 years ago now, I made the decision to cut out meat from my diet for various reasons. And it was not that I'd recommend people do this now, but at the time, it was a very overnight decision. I was kind of just like, I don't want to eat it pretty much ever again. I'm just not going to do it. But I come from a very science-heavy background. Like my dad is a physics academic. His parents are physics and chemistry academics. And so science is everywhere. And it meant that if I was going to accept the responsibility of making such a drastic decision, I couldn't let that impact anything nutritionally. So I had to take a big deep dive into nutritional precautions to take, what I need to know about vegetarian diets, and later that became vegan, but at the time it was just vegetarian. I really was just cutting out meat. And I think when I made that decision, my mum was also like, you can make that decision if you want, but I'm not going to be cooking double meals, so you also have to learn to cook stuff. And I was like, fair, can't argue with that. So I ended up keeping like a notebook of all of the recipes that I learned or started to make that I quite enjoyed. And then when it came to being at uni, I had obviously that was maybe it couldn't have been 2016. 2016 was when I started uni, so it was way before 2016. When I got to uni, there was a lot more talk about vegetarianism and veganism and the impact of meat on the environment and on health and things like that. And I had a lot of friends that would express a lot of interest in wanting to make similar lifestyle changes, but not really having any kind of idea where to begin. And so they'd ask me where I began. And so I basically mocked up like a 1-page do's and don'ts kind of thing that I could just send to my friends when they asked me. And in combination with the fact that I had all of these recipes in a book, tried and tested, I just decided to make like a typed up version of that document. And at one point I kind of just took a step back and I was like, there is quite a lot of information here and people seem to be really interested in knowing more about it. And the more I also took trips to like Waterstones and things like that, like there are a lot of vegetarian cookbooks, but I had the idea of doing a vegan student handbook. So the first half of it is all like student life, student living, time management, it's got a laundry guide in it. Like, there's all of these kinds of things about student life as alongside all of the recipes that I'd come up with. So I basically typed this up and just took a step back and was like, there is quite a lot of information here. I don't really know what to do with it, but there are people that work in the industry and have like professional opinions on this kind of stuff. So I'm just going to finalize it as if it were a book. But ultimately, when I sent it off, I was hoping that it would get rejected and they would give me feedback on like what it would need to be something worth publishing in a couple of years' time, like in 5 years' time, if I wanted to publish it either myself or through an agency, then I'd know, okay, it needs this tweak, it needs that extra recipe, it would need that kind of skill, this kind of insight, whatever. And yeah, so I basically had this big document that I'd written, and this is going to sound really unprofessional, but I was on summer holidays in Portugal, and just before going on like a night out with my friends, like found agencies that took online submissions of manuscripts, because I don't have the money for a literary agent. I don't know anyone in the publishing industry. I'm not a name by any stretch of the imagination. So found agencies that took online submissions. I found 5 of them. I sent it off, and it was kind of like a set it and forget it kind of thing. Like, I sent it off, didn't think about it for, well, months. And yeah, a couple of months later, I was in the office when I was a student union officer at the same university I did my undergrad degree at. And my mum calls me whilst I'm at work, and she never really calls me when I'm at work. And she said,
thinking the worst. Do you always think the worst? I'm like, why?
Yeah, I was like, who's died?
Yeah, I'm like, just prepare yourself for someone to be dead.
Yeah, I was kind of like, this is. I'm not sure if I even want to answer. I did, and I'm kind of glad I did, because she was like, Nish, there's a really important looking envelope for you here. It's got like a red wax seal stamp on the back. It's A4. Like, this doesn't look like a bill. You know, we should see what this is. All the girls were in the office, and she opened it, and bearing in mind, I'd forgotten at this point that I'd even sent off that manuscript. And yeah, it was this agency that were like, yeah, love it, willing to publish it, here are the terms and conditions, contract kind of thing. And then I just took a month to fully decide whether it was something I wanted to commit to, because I mean, submitting the manuscript is only like, I don't know, the tip of the iceberg of the work that really needs to be done. Yeah. And I'm a slightly impulsive person, and I was kind of like, yeah, I do really want to do this. So yeah, just signed it. And again, the rest is history.
That's incredible to sort of, I mean, it gives a real good insight to sort of, for me anyway, your sort of mindset and your personality to be like, I've done this, I'm going to try it. And then here it is, and be like, yeah, fuck it, let's go for it. Let's just, because you could have been at the point where, you know, some people, something that I want to ask you is, what did it feel like? Because obviously I have my own experience of this. When you would have done all this work, you've gone through this process, and then it comes down to it where you press go, essentially, and it becomes life, and then you are exposed to a degree. Did you feel exposed when you sort of submitted it to be like out there in the world?
Somewhat, but equally, I think if I think back to that particular time, I never felt anxious or scared or worried, like, because I expected it to start with a rejection. Like, both outcomes of if they rejected it or if they didn't and they accepted it, I see huge and equal amounts of value in both of those experiences. So firstly, back to like parts of my personality, one thing that I will say about this whole publishing, being slightly impulsive kind of thing, is that I will never be the one to say no to myself first. So if someone else wants to do that, aka I send this off and they want to tell me, no, this isn't good enough, we won't publish it, absolutely fine, I accept that. But I will never say to myself, oh, I'm not sure I should do that, I'm not sure I should send off that application, apply to that job. Like, someone else can make that decision. I can present what I have to the best of my ability, and if it's not right, they can tell me. So that would be point number one. In terms of feeling exposed, yeah, I wouldn't say I really felt massively exposed, but I do I recognise that, like, it's not your everyday thing to do, as like send off a manuscript. So from that point of view, I do see what you're saying. But yeah, I think because I see such value in the failure and the success of either way that could have gone, to me, it didn't feel like anything particularly scary or not worth doing, or like, I don't know.
It seems like you have a good relationship with failure then. I feel like a lot of people, myself included, definitely an offence of mine, and something that I've spoken about before, is we're sort of, I don't know if it's like through school or society, but there's a lot of, I'd say there's a lot of misconception around failure. As we're brought up to believe it's a bad thing that, you failed that exam, and you're like, shit. Yeah. That is the worst of the worst. But
worst thing you could,
yeah, exactly. But if you flip it on your head and sort of approach it the way you do, which I think is amazing, and something that I've been trying to get better with myself, is that you only really learn from the failure. If you was just to always, if you was just always to walk up, take the shot and hit it, you'd be like, why is everyone so bothered? You'd sort of not appreciate the work and sort of the effort that goes into things if everything just hit every time.
100%. Yeah, I completely agree that like the system that most of us are raised in doesn't encourage a very like nonchalant attitude to failure. And I will say that that's not particularly something I learned in school as such. I learned that, and I'll go on to this in a sec, more at home, but also through sport. Like in sport, that you're not going to win every single match, you're not going to win every single race. You can work to win most of them, or as many of them as you can. But equally, so my secondary school was a sports college, and I was on quite a few sports teams.
Yeah.
And if you go into any kind of sport not accepting that failure might be a part of your journey and getting better, like if you don't expect that to be a thing, you're going to have a really rough time playing sport. Yeah, and you won't necessarily become the best sportsman that you can be, because you can't figure out how to elevate your technique or your skill or whatever until you're challenged with a better player who does it better than you, and you need to then go on the court or hit the track or whatever and figure out a better way to do it. Like when it comes to failure, and again, going back to the point about like this wasn't necessarily something I learned in school in the like exam sense that you mentioned. So on the sports field, on track, on court, it was very present. But outside of that, I think it goes back to science again, which is that when you're like this is a very simplistic way to look at it, but essentially think about designing a science experiment. You set a hypothesis, you do the test, you get your results, you analyze the data, and you figure something out. Even if you don't get the results you wanted that proves your hypothesis, that would be quite biased anyway. But the point is, if you don't get the results you wanted, that still tells you something of value, and you can't improve your next experiment to investigate something better the second time around if you didn't get those results in the first place. So for me, it's kind of like, I totally accept failure as a actually very necessary part of doing anything great. Like I haven't ever done excelled at anything or built anything great without encountering various hurdles and failing at various things. But it's not necessarily like, I don't think it's the failure, the encounter of failure that's many people's problems. It's the fact that they are in denial about the fact that it's necessary, or that they somehow think it's a reflection of them as a person. Like, I don't think I'm a failure of a person because I've encountered failures. I do think I would be a failure of a person if I encountered those failures and failed to learn from them and build from them and grow from them, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. And I absolutely love that, because I was actually going to mention about, obviously you mentioned that your parents has a science background at home, and you essentially just sort of answered my question without me asking it, of like, does that sort of background of, like you said, I'm not scientific in any way, you put it in a much more eloquent way than I did, but obviously being there and having parents who are in that environment and, like you said, need failure essentially to get to the point of where something is a success. I imagine that's quite a safe space. And I think that obviously I played sport all my life, and I think especially I had a sports psychologist on, a good friend of mine early on, and I asked him the question about when kids go into academies and at a very young age, it's normally because they are the best of their team, their area, their sport at that age. But then the rate of them actually making it to, professional level, paid level, is very slim, isn't it? And I think from stuff that I've seen with people that I know, it's sort of, they get to a point of like, why am I not the best anymore? Why can't I do this to the standard that I have been doing it? When essentially the pool around them has become, the bar and the standard has raised so much higher. And I think that there's an expression in cricket, I think it's cricket, it's called a flat track bully, where, the teams go out and they just absolutely obliterate lower standard teams, but they can never beat high standard teams. And that is something that I'm terrified of becoming in life. Like, I've developed this relationship now, and like, just try it. The worst that has happened is just someone might have a little giggle at you and you might not get the result. But I mean, you've just put that in probably one of the best ways I've heard it. So thank you for saying that.
Anytime. Yeah, I also think it's a question of identity. Because you look at those kids, for example, the example that you gave about kids in academies, when you're so good at something from such a young age, that then is baked into your identity and how you see yourself. And then if you hit a hurdle after a couple of years of playing and all of a sudden you're seeing other people get fast-tracked into professional levels and you're not quite making or whatever, I think there can be this tendency to a very natural response to think, oh, then I'm just really not on that level or whatever. And the fact is, unfortunately, some people might not be, but there equally will be people that fall victim to the idea that they're not and they won't be forever, as opposed to they're not at that moment in time. And that is definitive. There's nothing they can do about it. And that is obviously then feeds into how you see yourself and your self-esteem. The second thing I was going to say, I can't remember, what was it that I was going to say? You mentioned about cricket and, what were you saying?
I've said about the sort of the safe space of having sort of a science background at home.
Yes. Yeah. So the other thing I was going to say about that is that the way we're talking about it kind of shows like me in school understanding failure, me now like totally embracing failure. We love that. That is by no means a very linear journey, and there are multiple points along the way where like that is the hardest thing ever, of like being told by a parent when you're 15, basically trying to develop those skills.
Yeah.
Like it is a really big challenge, especially if you're only just trying to figure out how to regulate your own emotions and figure out what your place is in the world and what you like. Like there's so much going on at that time, that also having to learn to deal with failure and turn that into something useful is an immense challenge. As part of like a bigger picture though, this is something I've been thinking about in recent weeks. And it came from the fact that I recently moved out of my parents' house and I'm in now my own place by myself. And I obviously have never done this before, so I didn't really know what to expect of it. Looking back now, I have this idea and this system in my head of like checkpoints. So anything we go through in life that's like a big change, for example, like moving house or going through school or whatever, or like going from school to university, you should always expect certain things to happen and certain emotions to arise. And if you do, they can't really take over your life. Like I also think a lot of the things that people struggle with, again, through no fault of their own, like this sentence won't carry any judgment to the fact that people do feel it. But if we trace a lot of emotions back, a lot of them are rooted in denial, and the denial that some things just are. So, for example, if I expect that when I'm 15 and I'm learning to study, sorry, hold on, let me start that again. If I'm in school and I'm studying for my exams, I have to expect that there are certain topics that I won't understand and that I will need to study harder at. If I don't, and if I treat each topic with the same amount of focus and attention, that isn't going to get me the best grade. If I'm transitioning from school to uni, I will expect to find it, and I will tick this like as a little checkpoint. Okay, checkpoint, feeling lonely, missing my parents, whatever it is, like finding commonalities in the experiences that most people seem to have, I think is a really good way to prepare yourself. It's like publishing a book. Like if I expect to need a certain level of organization, and I should expect it to come back from the publisher several times with things to amend and things to improve on. Like I expect that to happen, and therefore it just is a very natural part of the process. Like I don't think anything can really be done without those. I mean, some people would call them hiccups, but like I don't know. It's just, to me, it's just so such an obvious part of the process that that's just how I see it.
And I think you're absolutely right, because sort of me just picturing that in my mind from my mind's eye and my perspective, you could call them speed bumps, but you're still on the right path. Do you know what I mean? These things, there's going to be potholes, there's going to be speed bumps, to make another analogy out of it, but it is sort of life, without getting too philosophical about it, is that, shit does happen. Exactly. If anything, I always go back to this quote, and I should probably find out who says it. I know who says it, but I can never sort of put the name to it. It's like life begins on the edge of your comfort zone.
Okay.
And you just said then about, there's certain types of failure in life. And again, I say this with no judgment, because whatever makes a person happy and comfortable is whatever makes that person happy and comfortable. But to me, never sort of exploring a new avenue or pushing myself to find out what if is a big phrase of mine. And it's like, to just sit and not ever have that thought would, in my mind, be like a failure. It would just be like, just sit and just sort of let everything go past and go by. That's terrifying to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's kind of like the regret of not trying will always eat you up more than the regret of having failed at something.
Yeah, 100%. My dad said something to me when I was younger, and it literally it's like my, the Roman Empire thing. Even though that happens to me, I literally think about the Roman Empire probably like 4 times a week. But Nick did that to me. He's like, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And I was like,
that's true.
And I was like, twice a week. She's like,
no, stop it.
I was like, I'm always thinking about it. But like, to be fair, I'm like, I know it's not Roman, but I'm covered in Greek mythology tattoos, so the jump isn't too far. But going back to that, is like this thing that my dad said to me is like, don't die wondering. Like, don't be on your deathbed and be like, what if? And I was like 15, and I was like, what the fuck's he on about? Like, sat in the car listening to my fucking headphones. But then it's just there now. I'm like, it's such a good thing to like live by, a mantra to have.
Big time. Yeah. And just going back to something you said a minute ago that reminded me of something I think you might appreciate about, do you know what? I'll be honest, I can't remember specifically what you said, but I can remember the thought.
Paraphrase. That's all I do in life.
Story of our lives.
Yeah.
I think it's, for a lot of people also, the whole, like, not knowing how to get somewhere kind of deters them from ever getting started. And it speaks to this idea of what's called the knowing doing gap, which is, you say, for example, you want to learn how to paint. Like, I don't know, we'll take Picasso as an example. It's the first person that comes to mind. You want to be a Picasso level painter, and you currently don't have any of the skills necessary to do it. So you know where you want to be and you know where you're at now, but there is a gap between the skills that you currently have in order to be able to execute a Picasso level painting. And your first one's probably going to be absolutely awful. But again, if you accept it, you'll be fine. And yeah, so you accept the skills that you have at the moment, but there is this gap between what you know you can do at this moment in time and what you want it to look like. And again, if you don't expect there to be a gap that you can then close with work, you probably won't ever get there. That sounds really negative. Let me see if I can add something to make that sound a bit more uplifting. It just goes back to that point of like accepting that you won't always be perfect from the get-go, and expecting yourself to do that is the biggest problem. Also, I've just remembered something else. Sorry, I'm so sporadic in thought.
I'm loving it. This is like me, so I'm loving it. So.
I love that. You mentioned earlier about like life happens and things get in the way. Speed bumps. That was what you said. We speak, like, I'm sure we speak about this quite a lot at work, which is the idea that like people always come to us and they'll be like, oh, I've eaten this, like I'm really off track, like I've fallen off the bandwagon, I'm off track. And we spend our lives reminding them that if you reinforce this idea that you're either on or off a track, you don't allow any room for those little mistakes to happen. And those mistakes are present in everyone's life. The most famous nutritionists, dietitians, doctors will always have days where their food looks different. And if you are in your mind off track, that means you have this idea of exactly where you need to be, exactly what that looks like. And often it's the image in our head of what that's meant to look like that kind of ruins it for you in getting where you want to go. So, I was speaking to someone earlier today and she mentioned that, she was going on holiday in a couple of weeks and she didn't really know how to handle the whole thing. And it was a birthday and she didn't know what to eat. And the important thing here is that those kind of events and those kind of speed bumps and potholes that you're talking about, so it happens for both the good things and the bad, the negatively perceived things, they are part of the journey. Like they are not a side track that only some really unlucky people get, or like enjoying a birthday isn't something that only really privileged people get to enjoy. Like that is a part of everyone's life. That is a part of everyone's human experience. And if you other yourself from that situation and say like, oh, well, I shouldn't be allowed to have a slice of cake on my birthday, like that kind of stuff isn't for me, or why have I hit this pothole, why have I hit this speed bump, like that only happens to really unfortunate people, like that simply isn't the case. And again, it goes back to expectation. Like you can expect to experience those things in different quantities somewhat to other people, but to outright say, I shouldn't be experiencing this speed bump or this pothole or whatever, you're doing yourself a disservice in advancing and moving your life forward and supporting yourself through those really tough times.
Do you think, putting you on the spot a little bit here, but from like a psychology point of view, because you mentioned the human experience.
Yeah.
Do you think that people try to other themselves from sort of general human experience through like unrealistic expectations of sort of, they get this goal in mind, so say it's nutrition, people are like, right, I want to drop 5 cloth sizes. I've now created myself that this sort of idea that I want to become, I've othered myself. Is that a common thing, or have I just made something up in my head? Because it seems something that I'm picturing, that people are just like, right, I'm no longer this person. My identity has to be the person that is losing X or doing X.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great question. Firstly, I think, and we know this, the brain is attracted to very simple ideas, and human behavior is incredibly complex, and understanding your emotions is incredibly complex. So off the get-go, those two kinds of things are already at odds. In terms of othering yourself, I think also a lot of people do fall into the trap that like things only happen to other people. And naturally that distance puts you slightly out of touch with yourself. And ultimately, if you're trying to induce any kind of behavior change or building habits or, setting yourself a roadmap to publish a book, like you have to be super in tune with yourself. Because those potholes and those speed bumps will always come up, and you have to have the skills to manage yourself effectively to get there. I don't know if that massively answers your question. You mentioned about othering. I don't know if I've missed anything out. If that was
I think that's like I think it gives sort of the broad perspective of that. You mentioned something then about we only think that things happen to others. There's something that I've noticed just of my own, like I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, but I read a lot about, habits and psychology and things like this, and it's sort of a massive interest of mine. Something that I found is that we all, I'd like to say, I think we probably all do, is suffer from like main character syndrome. We all sort of put the expectation on ourselves that because we are the forefront of our own story, we are the main character of our story, we cannot detach from that. Other people perceive us as the main character of the story. What is there a terminology for that in psychology, or have I just sort of made something up from what I've read?
There might be. I will just say I'm not a psychology expert, despite having a degree in psychology. Can you expand a bit on the idea that you've just mentioned, and I can see if I can speak to any of it? Like, just talk about that.
So, you know, when you get something that I've suffered with is that I would be scared of putting, you know, a post up, publishing a book, doing this, because one person might comment on it and say, that's shit, blah, 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 X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, oh my God, no, all this person thinks about in their life is how shit my work is. But really, in reality, if I detached from this main character syndrome that I've experienced and I've felt, and I know other people have felt, that in reality, I would think that that person's just probably had 10, 15 seconds where they've been in a bad mood or they've come across it, and then they'll move on to the next thing. So like you say about people thinking, oh, that can only happen to others. But do you get it on the flip side of where like people are like, oh, it only happens to me because I am the focal point of this, and I'm sort of woe is me, essentially.
Yeah. Okay, I'm with you.
I've probably explained that terribly.
No, not at all. I think I might have something to add to that. So there is a concept in psychology which kind of reflects the fact that we are and this kind of goes against your point, but is still relevant. We are far more preoccupied with perceiving ourselves than other people are with perceiving us. And in studies, self-perception is vastly, the perception that other people have of us is vastly overestimated with frequency than the other way around. So given, like with the example you've just shared with like putting posts up, people are essentially the bottom line of it is people are way too worried about themselves than they are to criticize other people. And when it comes to building on the idea of your post, for example, one question I did have for you, which I know flip side for the interview or whatever.
I love it.
But so you mention that you potentially sometimes think about putting these things up, but you stop and think, God, what if someone says that's awful? Like, would you, if you had a friend who was doing what you do, would you speak to them like that?
No.
Okay. So why do you also consider speaking to yourself like that? Even if it's through the guise of someone else?
I love that.
You know?
Yeah, I've sort of come across that before, and like it is so true. It's sort of, I think it's Jordan Peterson. Is like treat yourself like you would caring for a friend.
Yeah,
I think it is, and it's sort of a similar concept of that.
yeah,
And it's a great way to sort of, again, going back to like leading your life by certain sort of, you know, characteristics and mantras. But when you've just said it, then it makes perfect sense. And sometimes it's like, if you had a friend who was, like you said, going through these things, well, it depends on what type of person you are, but for me, definitely, I wouldn't be like, yeah, you're right, that's shit, don't bother. I'd be like, what's the worst that's going to happen?
Yeah, it's kind of like, you've asked what's the worst that can happen. What's the best that can happen? Like, what if you post that and it really impacts someone's life? Like, I find this a lot with my food community online. I have quite a small following in the grand scheme of followings on Instagram, for example. On my Nourish With Nish page, I have like 1,800 followers. And to some that might be quite a lot. In comparison to others, that is minute. What it is tightly knit. And I know through building that platform that the things that I post on my stories or the posts where I think, sometimes there is a voice inside my head that says, oh, but like, does anyone actually really is anyone actually really interested? the point of it isn't necessarily to be sure that other people are interested, because the things that you share have value whether they're interested or not. And another thing to remember is that most people are too scared to tell you that it was a good thing in their lives. Like, a lot of people will scroll through your content and think, oh, that's a good recipe, I'm going to save that. But they're never going to message you and say, that's a really good recipe, I'm going to save that. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So you have to give weight to the idea that that happens without you knowing. And that was going somewhere, but I can't remember where now. Classic. Oh yeah, building this community online. Tight-knit community. What was I saying?
He was going back about, like, I think he was going along the lines, I might have put words in your mouth, of sort of the importance of providing to a community, maybe?
Basically, that is it. Like, it doesn't necessarily matter to me that I don't have, 100,000 followers, because I know that the few people on there, I'm quite lucky in the fact that they are quite vocal and they are quite receptive to giving me feedback and comments. But I have to, when I was first starting out and you have like 200 followers, there will be plenty of people looking at your content and being like, this is irrelevant to me. You kind of just have to think, this will at some point reach an audience where it really does matter for them. And again, it's about like crossing that knowing doing gap of like, I know this will get there. I'm working on bridging that gap. It looks like this at the beginning, it looks like this at the middle, and it looks like that at the end. Like, I just have to accept that all of those checkpoints are part of the process. And yeah, I'm very lucky that on my food page now, there are quite a lot of people that comment, and they're very receptive to talking about things and asking questions and all of that. But it wasn't always like that. Like, at the beginning, I had to override that voice in my head that's like, oh, what if no one cares about this? Well, it doesn't matter, because I care about it. And I know that at some point other people will care about it. The people that are there saying, even bearing in mind, anyone that tries to grow a platform, or for example, like you're doing with your podcast, right? You should expect that a small number of people will not care, like outright. What you can't do is let that then interfere with whether you think what you're doing is of value. If you expect there to be a small number of people that feel that, that's fine. That's part and parcel of the process. Ultimately, obviously, the aim is to have way more people that do than don't, but you'll never really figure that out until you really try and overcome, or like not give weight to those small minority of people any more so than you would give weight to the people that are massively encouraging you. Do you know what I mean? Like, you should validate the good people and the good feedback and the good comments that you get just as much, if not more, than the negative. And that's not to say there isn't sometimes an element of constructive feedback in the negatives. Like, some people might scroll past your content because they're not interested, because they don't think it's engaging enough, and you could work on your hooks, or you could work on this. Like, that is still valuable. But someone saying outright, that's an awful post, like without any reason otherwise, like that doesn't, I also don't think that can really carry that much weight with a person unless you somewhat believe that internally on your own level.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of people sort of, especially going back to working in sort of fitness and coaching people, it's sad really how many people you see that start with that back foot, where they think any criticism, even if it's just people criticizing for the sake of it, like you said, and there's nothing constructive, because there is, like you said, there definitely is a place for constructive criticism. If you're getting the same comment 5 times, like, this is boring because X, and that X is creeping up at like a 5-to-1 ratio, you should probably address that at some point. But like I said, if someone's like, this is shit, you're like, oh, sick, mate, nice one, what can I do with that? Thank you for, putting that out there. And that, for me, was definitely a battle, and I'm still fighting, but I'm a lot better with. And you mentioned it then about when you started, that you felt that. How did you, was there anything you did consciously that you can think of that helped you overcome that? or was it just grabbing the bull by the horns and being like, fight through it?
Great question. Also, before I answer that, just remember that you will rarely, if ever, be criticised by someone that's doing more than you. So that criticism that comes without...
Love that.
Do you know, that criticism that comes without the construction element of it rarely comes from someone that is ever doing better than you.
People never shoot for those below them.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's like never look down on someone unless you're helping them up. Like it's that kind of principle, but in reverse.
Oh, there's so many snippets we can use off this already. Great stuff.
I'm full of them. That is helpful. This is how you get to having so many ideas.
I love it. Keep doing it.
So your question was... So I just remember saying grabbing the bull by the horns, but I can't remember what the...
So you mentioned about having this self-doubt initially at the start when you made your page.
Yeah.
And you've grown it.
Yeah.
Impressive, by the way. Well done on that, because like I'm there, you're there where I want to be. So excellent work. So like when you started and you was in this sort of stage where I'm similar to now, and you had that self-doubt, but you was aware that it is self-doubt, was there anything that you did consciously to sort of treat yourself like a friend, to take yourself out of yourself and sort of like have that not a what's the word, an out of body sort of thing, but like just like, right, Nish, you need to do this to do this, and sort of be your friend to yourself, like you mentioned before?
Great question. Off the top of my head, the only thing that comes to mind is that obviously, like, you'll know this in a sports context and a fitness context, like the most important thing is consistency. And it's kind of hard to be consistent at something or stick with something if you don't have a really pure love for it outside of any validation you could get. Like, if I was posting to an audience of 0 people, I would still take the photographs. I would still make the meals. Like, it doesn't matter to me whether someone else says that they love it or they hate it. To me, the process of doing it in and of itself brings me enough joy that kind of carries me through it. And so when it comes to hearing criticism from people about things, it doesn't really ever cross my mind to give it any weight, because again, based on what we've just said, like, they're probably not doing much anyway. In terms of like things that I definitely said to myself, okay, Nish, you need to get your head together and do this and do that. I honestly wouldn't say there is necessarily. I think it's more an attitude of like, you have to be okay with whether people like it or not. But equally, listen to people. Like, listen to people, talk to people. There is like one of the biggest things that I see so much value in is that you can always learn something from someone else. You can learn something from other people that know less than you, know more than you, know the same topics that you do, know absolutely nothing about the topics that you do, whether it's an attitude or an approach or an actual like fact about the same field that you're in or whatever. Like, there is not a single human interaction or conversation or experience that you can have with someone that you can't learn something from. And ultimately, like, that constant, like, honestly, I just feel like a sponge all the time. Like, I'm constantly tuning into what people are saying and trying to understand what I can take from it. Like, what can I learn from it? Even if that learning is, don't validate everything everyone says all the time. Like, that is still a valuable learning to make, but it kind of also only comes from being confronted with people that present that. So again, it goes back to like right at the beginning of our conversation when we're talking about failure. Like, when you're confronted with the potential idea of someone saying, really don't like your posts, content is awful, kind of thing, if you approach that with curiosity and not judgment, or like any kind of moral judgment against yourself, like, you can make something so valuable out of that. So again, sidetracking, back to your point about grabbing the bull by the horns, and if there's anything I can really, like, if there was anything I really said to myself, there wasn't. And I kind of think that my, not approach, but like my ability to be so consistent and be so organized with food was because I had a very natural affinity to wanting to make that work for myself. And it just so happened that because I love sharing things with other people, that just grew from it. But ultimately it started with me. And I think it all has to start with us. Like, you can't pass love or knowledge with real authenticity and with real long-term value to other people if you're actually not that into it yourself. And this is why it's like, yeah, some people say that there are more important things in life than following the things that you love. But ultimately, doing something that you hate also won't necessarily make you any happier or any of a better person to be around. So I appreciate that not everything has to be super like, you know, drop everything and follow your dreams, although for some people that is a viable option. But equally, if you're going to try and make anything work, especially if that involves teaching other people or passing knowledge or sharing information with other people, like, you have to have a very fundamental love and affinity for what it is that you're doing. Otherwise, when it gets tough, you're not going to stick around for yourself. You're not sticking around for anything. So
yeah, and something that you said then, so you can disagree or agree with me, but I think that to get the best out of anything you need to do, it needs to be selfish. You need to love it. You need to enjoy it, because I actually said this on the last podcast with the last guest I had. This sort of, because he delivers like boxing to people with behavioural issues and learning disabilities and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And he's like, I think it's selfish that I get this buzz. And I was like, but it should be selfish, because if it didn't give you that buzz, if it wasn't something you was chasing, you wouldn't do it at the standard that you was doing at so high. So I think a lot of people feel like they dance on that precipice as like, we're told not to be selfish, because we sort of like, oh, you become a narcissist, you become an egomaniac, you become this. And they happen. They are very, very true things that some people can go right to one end of the spectrum with. But I do this. I chat to people. I pick people's brains for over an hour and chew their ear off, because I just fucking love it. It's so interesting. But from that, hopefully people listen to it and get something from it. But if I didn't enjoy this, I wouldn't be reaching out to people. I wouldn't be doing this. Like you've mentioned, you wouldn't be taking the photos. You wouldn't just be doing it to be like, yes, love that. And I think people miss. I think that is a big thing that people miss, is that you've got to put yourself first the majority of the time.
I wouldn't necessarily say, like, I understand how that's selfish, but like, why shouldn't you matter in all of this?
Exactly.
Like, we at large, and especially, like, if you look at society at large, this is something that is a pressure that's put among a lot of women, which is to always put other people first and constantly be in service to other people, often at your own expense, you know, whether you have kids, whether you run a house, whether you're having to do all of that and a job. Like, not to say that men don't do that, but generally speaking, women probably fall under more pressures in that respect. Yeah. Like, you also matter in the middle of all of that. Like, you are also a person. And like, going back to your previous guest that did the boxing, like, I understand what you're saying in terms of like that buzz being selfish, but equally if it also benefits so many other people. It's not like to me, if I think about the word selfish, it's you putting yourself first to a negative impact to those around you. Like that, if I think of a selfish person, that is what I think. Like, they're doing things for them without any regards for how it might negatively impact those around them. I do think that is very different from someone including themselves in a picture that benefits people around them. Like, they're not, yes, they both start with one person in the middle of that like circle, if you like. But I do think that because the outcome is different and one is more desired, that type of selfishness is necessary and is beneficial and isn't something that you should necessarily be afraid of embracing. like, yeah, you absolutely should look after yourself and you should invest in yourself, and you a lot of the times should put yourself first. If that then means that you can build the community around you and you can support other people around you, like, you are equally as valuable as of a person in that picture as anyone else. And it can't really build if you don't consider yourself. And again, I do think that is a very different situation than people that only put themselves first to the detriment of the people around them. But yeah, it absolutely has to start with you, and you are definitely a person that matters. Like, I struggle with the idea that some people think it's almost a flex to do everything for everyone else but nothing for themselves. Like, this idea of like self-sacrifice. And again, I understand that for some people's roles in society, that is a necessary part of the role they have to fulfill, like a parent, for example. But if I think about examples of parenting, not just in my own family, but all around me, like, if I look at the happiest mothers, for example, they somewhat tend to be the ones that also somehow, whether that's through a family support system or neighbour support system, friend support system, whatever it might be, that mean that they can take some time for themselves every week to go to Pilates class, go do some shopping that's not stocking the fridge for their family, like something that's just for them. Like, if you feel if your own cup is filled, you can then pour into other people's cups. But again, it's that idea or that philosophy of like, you can't really pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
And yeah.
That's that. Yeah, brilliant. I love how you put that. And it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier. You have to put yourself first to get the best outcomes for others. Because like I said, if your glass is empty and you don't enjoy what you're doing, you hate what you're doing, you're not getting anything from it, how can you, as an individual, give anything on empty? And the only way you can charge yourself, that I feel, is doing stuff of purpose for you. And that purpose looks different for everybody else. You know what I mean? What I enjoy, you might not enjoy. What you enjoy, I might not enjoy. But there's commonality in most things. And like, you know, if you're happy, you know, since, you know, hippy dippy, shit like that, philosophical, whatever. But like, there's a reason that, you know, we all strive for happiness. It's something that is ingrained in us, in our brains, in our evolution, whatever it is that you believe in. I reckon you can't not find being happy in anything, in any theory or anything. I reckon it's always like, try and be happy, try and be a happy person, and that will make others around you happy, everything you do better. Like, has anyone ever said, live a sad life and expect good outcomes?
For sure. Happiness is a secondary effect to a lot of other things, though. Have you ever watched this? There's a really good TED Talk on exactly this, and it's titled something, again, paraphrasing, but it's something along the lines of why you shouldn't chase happiness, or like why you shouldn't try and achieve happiness.
Yeah, I have.
And it basically talks about the principle that like happiness is a secondary effect to things like purpose and belonging and community and getting a sense of fulfillment from those kind of things. Like, happiness tends to stem from it. But also this idea that like, if you're constantly chasing happiness,
you'll never get it.
Yeah, because you treat it as like an endpoint destination as opposed to...
I have seen it, and it's a great thing. Yeah, I'll link it down here. Actually, I'll put it in the description at the bottom, because
great watch.
That is something that, you know, maybe sort of counterintuitive, sort of negating what I've just said. But like, you can't have it as a destination. It has to just be, like I said, a secondary thing, and that's a brilliant way of putting it. Well better said than how I've just worded it. But yeah, you're so right. And it's funny, isn't it, that we sort of change these things. It's probably societal that like happiness is the end goal. Not working again is the end goal. Doing this, being sort of these things. And a big person that I love to listen to, love to read, is Robin Sharma. And he's just released a book, and it's like The Wealth Money Can't Buy. And it goes into like 8 different subjects of wealth. and finance is just one of them.
Yeah.
But I think it's so ingrained to us, especially our generation, probably from generations gone, of like where money was scarce, and like times were tougher. It's like you've got to chase the bills, you've got to chase that paycheck. But your problems at £20,000 a year. All right, well, them are your problems at 20,000. But if you get to 50, you're just going to have problems at £50,000 if that's your only sort of fundamental base of happiness, or the feeling of like, this is it, the goal is to get this. You'll just always be chasing your tail. There's other things, isn't there, in life that you need to caveat with that together. And I feel like my generation, I don't actually know how old you are, so I won't put you in my bracket, but like we just always like money.
Yeah.
Once you got money, that's it. You'll be cozy. But, it's very rare you see it. I know people who have gone and got money, and if anything, it's done the opposite.
Miserable, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. My grandma used to have a fridge magnet that used to say, the rich are not those that have everything, they're the ones that don't need anything.
That's where you get your quotes from.
It's my grandma's fridge. Full of
Shout
them.
out.
Shout out grandma's fridge.
Love that.
But I think, it kind of just summarises the point you just made. Was that something else I was going to say about chasing things and endpoints? Oh, you mentioned someone that you follow that's recently just brought out a book. And one of the people that has most, like going back to our conversations on failure, for example, one of the people that has most influenced my ability, I guess, to embrace things like failure is a man called Simon Sinek. And he has a podcast called A Little Bit of Optimism. And he has one episode in particular that I love. And it's from the old season, I think, but I seem to remember it very clearly. And it's about living in the grey. So many things in the world that we live in are designed, again, our brains are attracted to very simple ideas. And the world that we live in is designed to make things very black and white and very one thing or the other, and not making it possible for two things to be true at once, which is something that I, for example, totally reject. Even just going back a minute ago when you were like, oh, this totally contradicts what I just said. I think both of those things that you did say can be true at once, even opposites. But in this podcast, he talks about living in the grey, which is that like most of the things we experience in this life are not black and white. And there is so much value and beauty in that grey area in the middle, which includes accepting that multiple things can be true at once, even if they contradict each other. So if anyone wants any recommendations or things to listen to about mindset changes and navigating the world that we live in to come out as somewhat more of an optimist, bearing in mind Simon is someone that very openly speaks about like periods of depression that he's experienced in his life and how that kind of catapulted him to do what he does now. He's a great speaker. He's so easy to listen to. I actually saw him live last year with Stephen Bartlett, and it was amazing. So would recommend big time.
Does he have a TED Talk?
Probably.
Does that name is ringing a bell? Does he like wear glasses?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's great.
Constantly on Reels and TikToks. All sorts of things, or at least in my feeds. The
algorithm's got you.
I know. I've curated it in my favour, to be fair.
Yeah.
That's actually really maybe quite an interesting thing to talk about, which is like we think about the things that we consume in terms of like the food that we eat and the diet that we follow, the exercise that we do. But I think people also massively negate the idea that the social media content that we consume also feeds our brains. And you can absolutely work that against you or for you. Like if you interact with certain kinds of content that doesn't really support, growth mindsets, positive attitudes, like building. Yeah, basically.
You can say it. Just say it. TikTok, bro. Yeah.
You think like good new things in your life, but equally, you can absolutely train those algorithms to really help you, like, not elevate, but I guess just build
elevate
better ideas and skills.
Yeah, to sort of, you know, social media is an echo chamber, and it's a dangerous echo chamber at times because it can relay your more sort of forefront insecurities to sort of say, just keep living like this, little pat on the head, keep doing it like that. And when in reality, sometimes them things, it's the absolute opposite that you need to see. It's like, come out of it, break away from it. You know, that 4-minute car chase that has provided nothing to your life that you've watched 13 times on TikTok for the last 4 minutes or whatever. It's just, you're just absolutely consumed by something that's mindless. You could be putting that time better spent to something else that you are as equally interested in. But I think it goes back to, like, people just want to switch off sometimes, and that's perfectly fine. That is perfectly fine. But I feel like because it's so accessible, it's so easy to do, that a lot of people have gone past doing it as a switch off. They've just gone, that is the constant state of which they are in.
I think that last point that you made is probably the most important one, which is that, like, I totally recognise that people nowadays are living under pressures and demands that far exceed what their bodies and their minds are designed from a purely evolutionary perspective to handle. And that stress and that pressure has to be comforted somehow, like it's a normal human response to want comfort during times of stress. But it's that point that you mentioned about, like, a little bit is fine, but past the point where it's actually potentially making your situation worse is when you need to become a bit more aware of the fact that it's happening. Although it does kind of, it reminds me of something I once heard someone say, which is that, and again, I learned this when I was looking into doing medicine, and when you learn about people, you know, people always say, like, oh, like, people are so lazy nowadays and all of this kind of stuff. And I don't doubt that some people are lazy, but there is always lazy people in every generation, in every civilization that's ever lived. So that's nothing new. But what I do think is interesting is that we, like, instead of saying to someone, or even to yourself, why am I so lazy? Like, why can't I do anything? Why do I just want to sit here and rot in bed or, like, not move from the sofa? Instead of saying to yourself, why am I lazy? Ask yourself, why does your body need so much rest right now? Like, why is it absolutely screaming for it? That is a really hard conversation to have with yourself, but equally it can, and, you know, some people are absolutely fine bed rotting and not moving from the sofa, and some people absolutely need it. Like, everyone's circumstance is so different, but there is a subset of people that, you know, maybe they do have dreams to do something else, but their social media and their phones are trapping them away from that. And that is a shame, because there are actually so many people that have such good ideas and such good aspirations that could, like, the world would love to hear it.
They're going back to Robert Sharma again. Sorry, fanboy, call me all you want. He says that you can play on your phone or you can change the world, but you can't do both. Like, and that's an extreme way of looking at it.
Yeah.
But it's a great message to be like, you know, you can put all your energy into the device, or you can put your energy into, like you said, them people that, you know, we might never see their best because they're not talking to themselves. And I think what I'm getting from that, and my perspective, which might be wrong, and feel free to challenge it, is that I think in society there is a lack of having self-awareness. I think there's a thing where we care about the external factors a lot. We care about the extrinsic things, but we never take time to sort of sit and look at ourselves and ask them questions that you just mentioned there. And for me, like, me and meditation have a very tumultuous relationship, but I'm back in it at the minute. And as a person, when I meditate, I'm just such a better version of me.
Wow.
When I just sit and can just be like, right, that's why, this is that. And it's not easy, you know. I'm starting again from scratch, like 4 to 5 minutes a day But even just having that time to be like, why am I feeling like this today? What is it? What's happened? That's why journaling's great. And I think like, you know, if I'd have turned up at like 8 and gone to school and was like, I just want to sit and meditate or journal, they'd be like, are you a hippie?
Yeah.
Do you like, yeah, but now it's coming back in, don't get me wrong, it's much more in society now, but it's still frowned upon. And I think that's a big thing. I think everyone, my view, but I think everyone should take the time to learn about what's in the mind rather than just feeding it and dulling it.
100%. So 2 things from me on that. Firstly, back to your very first point about changing the world and going on your phone. To anyone listening to this right now, I had, when I was like publishing my book, or even when I went vegetarian and vegan and I wanted to start all of these pages and do food photography, blah, 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 there were people in my life with significant influence, like in my immediate circles, that outright would tell me that I can't change the world and that there's no point in me even trying. Like, why am I doing that? That's such a waste. And had I listened to them, I wouldn't have achieved almost anything. Secondly, in terms of like introspection and understanding yourself better, this is something I am a massive believer in, which is that most kids and definitely most adults should at some point in their life do a course of therapy. And that isn't necessarily because there's something wrong with them, but it does give you the skills to understand yourself better. And when you do, you can understand other people even better. And ultimately that builds for well-connected, happy, supportive communities. And this doesn't mean you have to change the world. I learned actually a really nice saying when I went to uni in Swansea, so that's where I did my undergrad. There's a Welsh proverb. I don't speak Welsh, so again, I'm going to translate and paraphrase, but it basically says, you should want to be the man of your own square mile. So instead of changing the world and having this idea of like taking over everything and conquering and making massive waves, like if you focus on just the people around you, that is good enough, because then that also can mean that if they take on that responsibility and that attitude, that creates the biggest ripple effect than if one person had the crazy idea to change the world. Like, it's a lot more cumulative and a lot more productive for you to want to be the person of your own square mile than it is to like want to rule the world. But back to therapy, massively agree that like understanding your emotions and your thoughts and why they arise and what you can do about them, etc., is one of the most important things you can learn about yourself. And again, going to therapy like unequivocally does not mean there is something wrong with you, but it can provide you with skills and tools that most parents don't teach their kids, that most schools don't teach their kids, but all of a sudden we then become adults and you can't really navigate the world without them. And that's why so many people, through no fault of their own, reach like the corporate world, or they reach university and they are totally out of their depth because that is a kind of education that most people miss out on. Like, emotional education is just as important as knowing how to add 2 + 2, in my opinion.
For me, probably more. Just from my opinion, it's probably emotional maturity and just emotional like awareness. Yeah, intelligence is just. Yeah, you can see when people don't have it, and you can see the impact even that they have on a room, you know, like just vampires of energy. and you can spot them a mile away. Do you know what I mean? And again, going back to schooling, we won't get into it because we'll be here for about another 4 hours if I get off on about it. But like, the school system is created to make industrial workers. Always has been. It's hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
And they've never changed it. Do you know what I mean? So you can sort of, again, no fault of anyone's, no fault of our own. We've just, the narrative has always been there. And it's sort of like, we're not industrial workers anymore, but we still got that mindset. But yeah, we're in these jobs. And like you said before, you made a point about our brains as humans deal with probably so much more than what they are meant to do.
100%.
I mean, just your phone alone. Think of all the information and the data that you process just off that one. Even if you're not, even if you're not a super popular person or have a lot going on, but if your notifications are enabled on your phone and every app in your phone has a notification, and that thing's going off, you're like, what's this now? Blah, 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 blah. What's this now? Blah, blah, blah. Or you're having a conversation. Oh, shit. And it's just, it would be, and I can definitely tell you, overstimulating because I suffer from it. But again, they're a brilliant thing, and they are, the reason that we're doing things like this and the reason that we can talk to people and do, but they have to be sort of, I think phones and devices and that, they have to be used to be beneficial rather than controlling, because I think sometimes they become the focal point of people's worlds.
100%. Oh, damn, I had a really good idea about something. Before you mentioned that, what was the very first thing you said? A really good idea about something.
I should. I say a lot of shit. This is why it's difficult for me to remember. I was talking about... It's gone.
Oh, I've remembered.
Yes.
Go on. It was about the point I made earlier about not being able to, we're not designed for the environment we currently live in,
mm-hmm.
which is true, and specifically to do with emotions. If I'm not mistaken, we, in our most recent settled community level of, or stage of evolution, lived in communities that were no bigger than about 120 people, which if we think about how many people we come into contact with nowadays on a daily basis, like whether that be your personal following on Instagram or like I, for example, have recently taken to building a following on TikTok and in a month gained 15,000 followers. When I think about that number, it's insane. My personal Instagram has not even 2,000 followers, but I know most of those people, especially from the fact that I'm split between two different countries. I went to universities, like I've done quite a lot in my life, and I've made friends with a lot of people in my life. Like 2,000 people compared to what I am designed, and the quantities of people that I am designed to connect with and be able to support is insane. When we contextualize that into what it means to scroll, for example, through the news, your brain is not designed to process the sheer amount of suffering that we are exposed to with world tragedies. And like globalization is a really good thing for so many aspects of our social lives. Like diversity is amazing. There are so many things that can be learned from different cultures. On the flip side of that, having access to every single tragedy and every single, war, genocide, bombing, shooting, like all of this kind of stuff that is centimeters away from your fingers simply isn't designed with your mental health in mind. Like your brain is not designed to process that level of emotion, even if you're super skilled at mastering your emotions, but even if you're super in touch and emotionally aware of yourself.
How to deal with them things. Have you ever read a book called Tribe by Sebastian Juergen?
Oh no, but I love a good book recommendation. Tribe.
From what you've just said, I'll send it you when we go off. But Tribe, Sebastian Juergen.
Okay.
Read that. It's brilliant. That sort of stems where you've just been, and like from his own sort of research. He was a war photographer, and he talks about like how tragedy and stuff and things of high, when people find a commonality to attach to, the community just enhances. And then it goes into like, again, smaller, how we're not meant to be in these big groups and how these mini groups, and then this is why there's so many sort of ideas and identities and things like that, and this is why everything's sort of pulling and throwing. It's a great book, very good book. I'll send it to you because I think you'll really enjoy it.
Noted. Right,
2 questions that I ask people, just because I I could talk to you all day, definitely, but I am very aware that we've been on for nearly an hour and a half. But so the first one before we go.
Okay.
3 habits or routines that are a part of your life that you would recommend to somebody, and why? If you've got 3. People struggle with 3, you know. It's not an unusual thing.
No, that's totally fair. Your first ever question in this podcast to me, well, not first ever, one of, was about how exposed I feel in certain situations. Talking about habits is definitely one of them, because I don't have any. I don't have almost any non-negotiables for my life. I know some people talk about, you know, they need their morning coffee, they have to get sunlight first thing in the morning, or they have to make their beds. Like, all of those things to me go, like, they fly straight over me. There's honestly not a single thing that I look at in my day-to-day life that I'm like, my success is dependent on that habit. However, I will say that there are a couple of things that I notice that if those things aren't in check, I can't be the best version of myself. And I'm not sure it can necessarily be like positioned as a habit, but definitely
Routine,
a conscious.
Maybe?
Hey,
A part of your routine, maybe.
again,
Maybe not as
don't have
intrinsic
one.
as a habit. Not very well.
I don't have one, especially since working from home.
Yeah.
Other than the fact that I have to work for a certain number of hours, I don't have a routine for getting into work, getting out of work, getting through work. And that is something, do you know what, that's probably the only thing in recent weeks that I've been very mindful of, that I'm trying to understand better in myself. But habits ain't it for me. I really wish they were. If I had to pinpoint like 3 things, though, that I guess it kind of is a non-negotiable then, but it equally isn't, and I'll explain why. So the first one that comes to mind is sleep. I know that if I don't sleep well, I cannot show up every day for myself or the people that depend on me to deliver a service, a support of any kind, to the best of my ability, if I don't sleep. This is not hypocritical of me, but again, points to the fact that 2 things can be true at once. I was up till 1:30 in the morning yesterday, photographing the meteor shower and the northern lights. And I woke up this morning and I felt maybe a bit more tired. And it's not so bad as a one-off, but if I stayed up till that late every day, the quality of any work or support I can provide for myself and those around me would crash significantly. So sleep for me is a big one. And I don't have a sleep routine. I don't have any sleep habits. I'm also very lucky that the second my head hits the pillow, I'm out like a light. I don't lie in bed for half an hour thinking about, I don't have any problems falling asleep, but I do know that I let very few things get in the way of my sleep. I guess it is a habit. My sleep.
It's a priority.
Yeah, big time. So sleep is number 1. Number 2 is the quality of the relationships with the people I have around me. If those aren't in check, if those aren't working well, serving us both, making me fulfilled, making them fulfilled, if something is off, that bleeds into every aspect of my life. And so a lot of the good things that I can do in my life also can be traced back to good quality relationships, A, with myself, and B, with those around me. So if those are out of line, everything else kind of falls apart. That's number 1. Number 2.
You don't have to have a third, by the way.
I don't think I do.
That's fine.
I would say diet. That's really cliche. And same with exercise. I'm also an awful exerciser, so that definitely isn't one. I would honestly just say my sleep and my relationships are probably the 2 pillars of everything good and successful in my life.
Right then, so your 2, not non-negotiables, not habits, not routines, but priorities, the pillars. I like that.
Pillars.
Different spin. I'm all here for different spins. If you had habits or routines in your life, what would be the one that you would pick to implement and why? Anything.
Sorry, hold on. So if I could pick a new habit or a priority that I don't already do, or one of the two that I just mentioned.
Yeah, like a habit or a routine that you may have done in the past or you've never done it before, and you're like, I want to do that. That's something that I would love to just give my time to on a regular basis.
Exercise.
Love it.
So when I was in school, again, I mentioned that my secondary school was a sports college. It's not a sports academy. And I loved it because it gave me so much structure. And obviously when people are physically fit, that again bleeds into so many good aspects of their lives. It did mean that since leaving school, I don't understand how that slots into people's worlds. And especially having played so many team sports growing up, I kind of don't really know how to exercise without that element of like cooperation or competition, because we were always in tournaments and meets and games, competitions, like all of that kind of stuff. I've really struggled to know how that works without any of it. So if I could pick one habit, and again, the tricky thing is I know the benefits are so well evidenced for physical health, mental health, even the ability to like sleep, for example. Not that, again, I have any problems with that, but you can never be too good, you know?
Rub it in.
Sorry. But yeah, if there was one thing that I could work to prioritize, it would be that. The problem is, I also don't feel bad without it. So there's no real incentive or massive drive to work towards it, but that doesn't stop the fact that like it would still benefit me. So it's a hard one to navigate. But yeah, I mean, for anyone listening, I would say exercise is always a good one.
Thank you so very much for that chat. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
We spoke almost nothing about publishing, so sorry.
What did I say to you when I was been messaging over the last few days? I was like, it will go wherever it will go, and I think it went to some great places. But before we go, when I stop the recording, we'll have a little chat after. Sorry guys, you can't see this bit. We're just gonna have a chat. But before we go, let people know where they can find you, where they can find out more about you.
Thank you.
Get the book, everything.
Thank you very much. So my food Instagram is probably my most active social media platform, which is at Nourish With Nish. Nish is the nickname that my friends gave me when I was growing up, because the Portuguese version, aka the actual version of my name, is a bit hard to pronounce in the English language, so it's stuck as Nish. So Nourish With Nish, and my book is, I'm quite excited to say, available literally all around the world, whether you're in Australia, America, Barnes & Noble, Waterstones, WH Smith, Amazon, the lot. If you fancy it, let me know. But yeah, if you just type it in to Google, it'll definitely come up. And I'm also very receptive to, contrary to what I just said about living in communities of thousands and that we're not built for it. I love it when people message me on Instagram and they just treat me like their friend, and I love that. So come and be my friend over on my food page.
Two things can coexist at once.
Yeah, absolutely. Two can be. Yeah, 100%.
Exactly.
100%. Yeah, come and be my friend.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm sure people will get a lot from it.
I'm very excited.